It was a quiet, rainy afternoon in a small town where everyone seemed to know everyone. The streets were empty, save for the occasional car splashing through puddles. In the middle of a local park, an elderly woman named Mrs. Emma Jones stood alone, her frail figure draped in a simple black dress. She was well known in the community for her kind heart and years of volunteering at the local shelter. But on this particular day, her peaceful demeanor was interrupted by flashing lights and the sound of sirens. 3 police officers approached her with stern expressions, and within moments, the situation escalated in a way no one could have predicted. Witnesses nearby watched in disbelief as the officers ordered Mrs. Jones to her knees. The rain poured down, soaking her clothes as she clasped her hands together, visibly trembling. Her voice, though quiet, carried an undeniable strength as she repeatedly asked why she was being treated this way. The officers, seemingly unmoved, continued to bark orders, their towering presence casting a shadow over the vulnerable woman. Passers-by started gathering, some recording the incident on their phones, others shouting in her defense, but the tension only grew thicker. What was supposed to be a routine patrol had now become a scene of confusion and distress. Mrs. Jones, known for her resilience, refused to fully comply, holding her head high even as she knelt on the muddy ground. The officers' actions raised questions, not just about their intentions, but about the chain of events that led them to single out this elderly woman. Just when it seemed the moment couldn't get any more intense, something happened that would leave the crowd and the officers completely stunned. Stay tuned to find out what unfolded next in this heart-wrenching yet eye-opening story. As the rain continued to pour, whispers circulated through the growing crowd. Those who knew Mrs. Jones couldn't understand why she was being treated this way. She had lived in the town for decades, always lending a helping hand, whether it was organizing community food drives or tutoring children who needed extra support. To see her now, kneeling in the mud under the watchful eyes of the officers, was both shocking and heartbreaking. Her neighbors murmured among themselves, trying to piece together what could have led to this confrontation. Some speculated it was a misunderstanding, while others suspected something deeper might be at play. Meanwhile, Mrs. Jones remained steadfast, her hands trembling slightly but her expression calm. She wasn't the type to panic, even under pressure. Her life had been marked by challenges, raising 3 children as a single mother, enduring financial struggles, and surviving personal losses, but she had always come through with grace. Her resilience had become an inspiration to many in the town, and now, even in the face of humiliation, she refused to break. Her soft voice rose above the rain as she asked the officers again what crime she was accused of, but their responses remained vague and curt. In the crowd, a young man with a phone in hand decided he couldn't stay silent anymore. He stepped forward and called out, demanding an explanation for the officers' actions. His words seemed to ignite the others around him, who began voicing their own frustrations. Yet, the officers stood their ground, their expressions unwavering. The tension escalated as more people joined the scene, some shouting, others recording every second. What had started as a quiet day was now spiraling into a chaotic moment, leaving everyone wondering what the officers weren't saying and why Mrs. Jones was their target. The crowd grew restless as the situation stretched on. Some began exchanging stories about Mrs. Jones, trying to make sense of why the police were treating her like this. A woman in her 40s whispered to those around her about how Mrs. Jones had once helped a family through a tough time, delivering meals when they could barely make ends meet. Others chimed in, sharing similar stories that painted her as a kind and generous woman. The more they talked, the more confused and frustrated they became. None of it added up. Why would someone as selfless as Mrs. Jones find herself in such a humiliating position? Meanwhile, the young man who had spoken up earlier began recording a live video on his phone, narrating the scene for those watching. His voice was steady but firm, recounting how Mrs. Jones had always been a pillar of the community and questioning the officer's actions. People in the crowd watched him, their expressions a mix of hope and uncertainty, as if they believed the camera might hold the power to reveal the truth. Across the street, a local journalist, drawn by the commotion, started scribbling notes and snapping photos, sensing there was more to this story than met the eye. Among the officers, a quiet exchange was happening. One of them, a younger man, seemed hesitant. His eyes darted between Mrs. Jones and the crowd, his grip tightening on his radio as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the courage. The senior officer, on the other hand, remained stoic, issuing sharp commands to maintain order. Every so often, he glanced toward the growing audience, a flicker of unease betraying his otherwise composed demeanor. As the rain fell harder, a voice broke through the crowd, a woman in her 60s, clearly emotional, accusing the police of targeting Mrs. Jones unfairly. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, fueled by a shared sense of injustice. It was becoming clear that this wasn't just about Mrs. Jones anymore. This was about something bigger, something that had simmered beneath the surface for too long. But no one yet knew just how far the ripple effects of this moment would reach, or the secrets about to unravel. The tension in the air was almost palpable as the rain poured harder, soaking everyone to the bone. Mrs. Jones remained on her knees, her hands clasped tightly, but her face was no longer just a mask of confusion. It now carried quiet defiance. The younger officer's hesitation grew more noticeable, his fidgeting catching the attention of the senior officer, who shot him a stern look that silenced whatever doubts he was battling internally. The crowd's murmur turned into a low roar of voices, each demanding answers and justice for Mrs. Jones. Suddenly, a man stepped forward from the crowd. His voice cut through the rain like a sharp blade. "What exactly has she done to deserve this?" he demanded, pointing toward the officers. His presence was commanding, his tone unwavering, and for a moment, the crowd fell silent, all eyes turning to him. He was a middle-aged man in a weathered coat, someone you might pass on the street without a second glance, but in this moment, he held the crowd's attention like a leader rallying his troops. The senior officer's expression hardened, and he barked out a curt response about following protocol, but it was clear his grip on the situation was slipping. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, as if the man's words had struck a nerve. And then something unexpected happened. A group of teenagers, drenched and shivering, began chanting Mrs. Jones's name. At first, it was just a few voices, but soon the entire crowd joined in, their unified cry echoing through the rainy street. The senior officer turned sharply toward the chanting, his authority challenged in a way he hadn't anticipated. The younger officer looked torn, his hand hovering near his holster, not out of aggression, but as though clinging to it for clarity in the chaos. A ripple of fear and anticipation moved through the crowd as everyone braced for what might come next. No one could predict how this standoff would end, but one thing was clear: something had shifted, and there was no turning back. As the chants grew louder, the senior officer's frustration turned to panic. He barked orders into his radio, demanding backup, his voice strained against the rising tide of defiance. The younger officer's hand now shook visibly, his conflicted emotions etched across his face. But just as the tension seemed ready to boil over, a loud crack of thunder silenced the crowd for a brief moment. In the eerie quiet that followed, a voice rang out from behind the crowd, calm but firm. "I think it's time we all stopped and listened," the voice said. Heads turned to see an older man stepping forward, his umbrella shielding him from the rain. He was dressed impeccably in a dark suit, his presence radiating authority. To everyone's surprise, he wasn't just another member of the community. He was Judge Harold Bennett, a respected figure known for his unwavering sense of justice. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and even the senior officer's demeanor shifted slightly, recognizing the man. Judge Bennett walked calmly through the crowd until he stood in front of Mrs. Jones. He extended his hand to help her up, but she refused, staying on her knees as a quiet act of resistance. The judge turned his piercing gaze toward the officers. "What exactly is the charge here?" he asked, his voice steady yet commanding. The senior officer hesitated, stammering about an anonymous tip regarding stolen property. But before he could finish, another voice interrupted. a young woman from the crowd holding her phone high. "I have the footage," she said. "The so-called stolen item. It's her own bag. They dragged her out here for nothing." A ripple of disbelief spread through the crowd, quickly replaced by anger. The younger officer took a step back, visibly shaken. But just as it seemed the situation was about to unravel completely, a black SUV pulled up, its tinted windows rolling down to reveal another unexpected figure. It was the city's mayor, alerted by the growing uproar. The crowd erupted in whispers, the stakes now higher than ever. No one could have predicted how deeply this moment would shake the foundation of trust between the authorities and the community. The mayor stepped out of the SUV, her expression unreadable as the crowd quieted to a hush. Drenched from the rain, she surveyed the scene, her sharp eyes taking in Mrs. Jones on the ground, the officers standing stiffly, and the tension that seemed to hang in the air like a storm cloud. Without a word, she walked over to Mrs. Jones and knelt beside her, offering her hand. "Mrs. Jones, please," she said softly. "This isn't where you belong." Mrs. Jones hesitated, but the warmth in the mayor's tone broke through her defenses. She reached for the mayor's hand, slowly rising to her feet. The crowd erupted in cheers, their energy finally breaking through the oppressive atmosphere. The senior officer shifted uncomfortably, realizing his authority was slipping away. The mayor turned toward him, her voice now firm. "I need an explanation for this. Now." The officer began to stumble through his response, but Judge Bennett stepped forward, holding up his hand. "Enough," he said. "This is not just about Mrs. Jones. It's about what this symbolizes. A community torn apart by distrust." His words struck a chord, and the crowd nodded in agreement. Then came the twist no one saw coming. The young woman with the phone stepped forward again, addressing the mayor directly. "There's more," she said, her voice trembling. "The footage I have, it's not just from today. It's weeks of harassment toward people like Mrs. Jones. This wasn't an isolated incident." The mayor froze, her jaw tightening. Turning back to the officers, she demanded their badges. The senior officer's face flushed with anger, but he had no choice. As the badges were handed over, the crowd cheered louder, their voices echoing through the stormy night. But as the scene began to settle, Mrs. Jones stepped forward, her voice steady despite the emotional toll. "This isn't just about punishment," she said. "It's about change." Her words lingered in the air, a challenge to everyone present. As the mayor promised a full investigation and reforms to rebuild trust, a small smile played on Mrs. Jones' lips. She had been knocked down, but she stood taller than ever, a symbol of resilience and hope for her community.